I think there's still a question in that, why is it necessary for such a universe to exist? And I think that's where faith maybe can start to kind of weigh.
One of the verses that just came to mind is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and mind. We're loving God, we're worshiping God as we engage in these questions. Hello and welcome to another episode of Postcards from Antioch. I'm Oz, leading today, and glad to have Jon Tandy, Dr. Jon Tandy, with us today, who will be helping us to understand a bit more about science and faith. And this is, as you hopefully know, if you've listened to one of our episodes before, this is a podcast series helping to teach and train and develop leaders through thinking biblically about different aspects of life and faith, whether theology, and today, science and faith. So, Jon, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks, Oz. Yeah, I had graduation this morning, so that was a nice event to attend. And looking forward to digging into some science and faith.
Good. And so you're a scientist at the University of Kent. What aspect of science do you particularly focus on and teach on and do your research in?
Yeah, so my background is in chemistry. I did a chemistry undergraduate and then a PhD in what we call laser spectroscopy, which is kind of on the interface between chemistry and physics. And nowadays, quite a lot of my research is actually within planetary science. Kind of exploring planetary surfaces and different makeup and supporting missions and things like that. So, it's exciting. But I also do quite a bit of teaching in forensic science as well, which is quite distinct, but also very interesting. And actually, surprisingly, has overlaps with some of the analytical approaches you might take with planetary science and the forensic science. So, it's fun.
Very good. So you're really interested in things like rocket launches to the moon recently. This week there was one, wasn't there?
Indeed, yeah. So actually, I've quite recently got invited to be part of a small cube satellite that's going to be launched to look at impacts on the moon. So that's one of the areas that I'm involved with, is understanding when you get big impacts on the moon, you get this big flash of light, and what we can learn from actually looking at that light about the actual impact event itself. And so,
really interesting. Wow. So you can see hopefully why we've invited yourself to be the lead on this particular session, science and faith, which is really good. Big subject. How are we going to go about this?
Yeah. So, I think maybe a nice starting point, Oz, I've got a question for you, is what do you think of when we say the word science? What one springs to mind? You have like a mental picture or something?
Yeah. What do I think of? I probably put it into a school category of learning, study, tripods, Bunsen burners.
Yeah.
And then I think back to my experience of science and how I enjoyed some parts more than others. And I'm sorry to say that although I did chemistry A-level, I found it really hard. I loved biology and it seemed to make sense to me, but I found physics and chemistry a bit harder. So when I think of science, I think of my own learning experience and how things work in the world today and can be understood for development, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You brought up that kind of understanding of the way the world works, and we'll probably maybe pick up a bit on that later on. I think we can get quite different responses to the word science, and I think some people can be maybe even somewhat negative towards science, perhaps a misunderstanding, or they just find it's very challenging to understand some of the concepts with science. I think sometimes you get stereotypical kind of images of someone holding a coloured liquid up. I think the sort of kind of media portrays it in that way. But I think it's maybe useful to have a bit of an understanding about broadly what science means. So I've got a bit of a definition. So the UK Science Council says that science is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. There's a few things that can be probably unpack there a little bit, but basically what we're saying is that, as you said, science is trying to make sense of the world around us, and also, and the more the social sciences, how we interact with each other as well. And I think often when we talk about science, people often think about the physical sciences,
yes,
kind of chemistry, the physics, the mathematics,
the human body, animal, plant life,
and maybe often think of lots of hard equations, but actually sometimes they forget about some of the psychology or the sociology, and they are sciences in their own right, and it's important to probably maybe incorporate that in the conversation as well. I
think that's really interesting because quite amusingly at university I went to study sport, health and exercise, which I was excited would be a Bachelor of Science, but actually ended up being a Bachelor of Arts, which is
Yeah.
quite amusing because the weighting wasn't quite enough on the physiology, anatomy,
Yeah.
but was more on other aspects. But my wife, she went to study environmental sciences and is very artistic and was like, why am I doing a science? I should be doing a BA. And so we find this quite telling that actually the environmental, human, social sciences can be overlooked. So that's pretty illuminating. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Yeah, good. So we're not just talking about science, we're also talking about faith. And in our current society, many people have a view that the two don't really go together, that they're quite opposing. You've got people that might be scientifically minded and those that are more spiritually, and it's about faith, but you'd call yourself a Christian that is also a scientist. So where do you think this idea of science versus faith has come from?
Yeah, I think actually, some people think this is often a modern thing as well, and actually it's not. And we might talk a little bit more later on about some of the kind of history of science, but I think partly people tend to put these in kind of two disparate boxes, and that might possibly due to be to kind of historic implications. And actually, unfortunately, through history, there was some kind of actually persecution of scientists actually by not just Christianity but also other faiths as well. I think also particularly in the last maybe 30 or so years, it's a misconception of what faith actually means, and particular prevalent atheists, people like Richard Dawkins, for example, is a very good example of that, with his kind of books like The Blind Watchmaker, for example, and what he would consider the word faith to mean,
right?
And this idea of a kind of blind faith, if you like.
Yeah.
And I think that has often that was very much popularized, going back when those books were first written. And so people who are perhaps on the fringes and that maybe not really thought too much about ideas of science and faith when, well, here's a scientist and he's making some very strong points about faith is now, relevant or whatever. And so they've kind of latched onto that idea of what faith, that kind of idea of that blind faith so Dawkins says, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Right. Now, I mean, as a scientist who has, been brought up in the kind of church thing, that's baffling to me because very much so, I think if you through growing up in church, the idea is you are learning more about your faith, you're diving deeper, and you're through studying scripture and prayerful, you're considering, and you also are weighing up evidence because of course there is a lot of different kind of beliefs across, even just within Christianity about the meanings of certain things within scripture. And so we are actually trying to piece things together very similarly actually to the way that science is that it takes these pieces of evidence from different fields and tries to see how it fits together.
And even the gospel writers, some of them, Luke particularly does that, doesn't he? At the start he talks about an orderly account and being a doctor and thinking about how to present information helpfully so that people might believe. And I think John says that as well in his gospel, in Jesus as the Messiah. So it's not just a blind faith, and that's what you're suggesting, that there's a misunderstanding of faith.
Yeah, that's right. And I think also perhaps sometimes people think of science as being very precise and as very rigorous, if you like, and maybe they consider faith as being a bit, for want of a better term, wishy-washy, if that makes sense. And it's not. It's something that's very personal, and I think that can put certain people off, particularly if they may be scientifically oriented, if you like, or very logical thinkers in that way. And actually, until you actually maybe investigate faith ideas a little bit more, you maybe don't perhaps perceive the idiosyncrasies perhaps of some of those things. But it's interesting. I think that it's worth pointing out that science does actually embrace some of these ideas. So for the perhaps classic example is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So I don't know if you've heard about this. So this is from way back. Werner Heisenberg, who's a very prevalent physicist in the time, was also a Lutheran Christian.
Right.
And he actually came up with this kind of fundamental concept within physics that says when you have a particle that is small enough, you cannot know precisely its location and its energy. And the reason is because the act of observing it changes one of those two things.
Oh, right.
So it's a fundamental concept. So there is a limit, basically, and science will acknowledge this, and it's very widely accepted, that we cannot know that precisely. And there's a constant, if you like, associated with that limit.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of worth pointing out that although we might perceive particularly the physical sciences, as being this very kind of rigorous kind
Yeah.
of piecing together of things. There's still a lot of disparity in certain theories. Perhaps we won't talk about that later. But so yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of an important point to make as well.
Yeah, so that's, and the other thing that I've picked up often has been that this we don't need God because science has brought the answers. We've moved on, we've progressed from that era, and again, that might be something we touch on soon. So good. So let's think a little bit about a couple of the big areas that come into this discussion. Creation being one, and maybe people think, well, can you believe in the creation account in Genesis and be a scientist? So how might we understand the creation story, given everything science has taught us, or that we've learned about the early universe? So the big one being the Big Bang.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the area that mainly deals with this kind of early universe area is with the cosmology. Is kind of the big science, if you like, that has looked at this, and actually it's seen a bit of a resurgence in recent years with some of the technological developments that we've had, and in particular trying to understand the very, very early parts of what we would call the Big Bang. So the cosmologists would kind of bring this idea of having a universe that starts with all of its matter and its energy in basically an infinitely small, what we call a singularity.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this was, from kind of measurements we made, we know this is about 14 billion years ago, approximately. And so in some ways, it's this kind of singularity idea is similar to what we think is at the center of black holes now. But obviously this is literally all the matter in the universe compressed into something incredibly tiny.
Yeah.
Now, of course, how that manifests, how that happened, or why it was like that is another thing. So the Big Bang says that this was the starting point, and at some point, this basically we had a kind of explosion event which threw all of the matter and energy out into empty space, and that was the creation, if you like, of the first part of the universe. And so the earliest kind of expansion of this, we formed this what we call hot plasma, which you might think of like a very kind of dense, soupy material, not literally soup,
that kind of substance.
That kind of substance.
Can't eat it, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's very, very densely packed energy and particles, all still expanding out. And actually, interesting, the first person to actually come up with this idea of the Big Bang was actually a Roman Catholic priest called Georges Lemaitre. So he actually came up with this idea, and the idea of the Hubble expansion, which just describes the way that the matter and energy expanded before Hubble. And of
telescope.
Course, this like the Hubble telescope, indeed, and there's a constant again associated with Hubble's constant with this. And this is quite prevalent in science that often the person that came with it first doesn't necessarily get the named principle or whatever it is. But so he was actually. This was around the kind of 1920s, and he first proposed this idea of a Big Bang. And there was a lot of kind of opposition to this. A lot of the scientists, and actually some because of his position as a Roman Catholic priest, kind of accused him of basically trying to fit God into the kind of picture by presenting this idea. And he basically pushed back and said, well, no, judge me on the physics, judge me on the mathematics. And eventually, of course, as people started to investigate this, they were able to make more observations. They came to the conclusion, actually, he was right. This is the best description that we still have for the early universe. Now, of course, so how does that fit with the creation story that we might have in the Bible? Yes. I guess is the big question with this. So we might think about, if we look right back at the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, and we have phrases like God speaking, "Let there be light," for example. Now, we might say, okay, well, where does that light occur? If you like, does it fit within this Big Bang theory? And if you were kind of looking at it from a kind of purely scientific point of view, you'd say that, well, that light in inverted commas probably only would have even existed in our measurement of time about 100 million years after the Big Bang, because of the fact that it was still so dense that light couldn't actually even penetrate it. So it's a bit of a kind of funny concept, and actually, if you were talking about the creation of light as our star or sun that illuminated the Earth, it actually would have been even further in advance, because our solar systems. Our sun is a kind of third generation star. So now I guess the point I'd like to make here is, does that matter?
Yes.
and is it appropriate to actually start to read Genesis 1 with that kind of scientific mindset, that lens of looking through it in that way?
How can I squeeze the Big Bang into this or make sense in our scientific understanding?
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. So how do we answer that
question?
question?
So I think, it's really important to look at the way in which Genesis is written and why it was written in the way it was. And so I would say that from what I've read previously, looked into this, I don't think there's many theologians that would say that Genesis 1 is an accurate scientific account of the creation story. So it's about the kind of genre, and actually Genesis is complicated because you could argue potentially there's actually several genres even within Genesis, but people often describe, or I've heard people describe, Genesis is written as almost like sometimes like a theological essay, or sometimes in a kind of meta mythos, or sometimes these kind of very broad terms that describe a kind of almost like a poetic nature to the way in which Genesis was written. And of course, it was written for an ancient people in a culture that was the way that they understood grand concepts.
Yes,
they didn't write literally, and in fact, even things weren't even communicated through writing anyway. They were very much through story, and that kind of big picture, if you like, descriptions.
Which kind of makes sense, doesn't it, when you think about the time that these accounts were possibly written and the events of creation themselves. There wasn't someone watching from the side, because man and woman wasn't created till later on in the process. And what did the 24-hour periods of time or not, and periods of time and all the rest. So actually, either way, you've got to have a style of communication that isn't analysis of something happening in the moment in front of you.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it's also worth pointing out that just because it was written in a way and it maybe doesn't fit, if you like, with the scientific writing, that doesn't mean that it's not important as a description of creating. We believe, of course, that it is inspired by God, and that actually there is real value in understanding that writing in a way that we can appreciate what it was,
which is much more than just a fairy tale that we can dismiss and get on with science again. And it just happens to kick off the Bible. So we can take it seriously, but we've got to treat it in the genre that it has been meant to communicate a message within. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And I think we kind of try to understand this as the idea that God, through some processes, and it may have been the Big Bang, however you want to think about that, was able, through his divine will, to start with basically nothing and create something that is our universe. Now, our universe is incredible, and if you look at it, it's incredibly fine-tuned. So the point is that people now know that the kind of physical constants that underlie the universe have to be so unbelievably precise to even start to create, kind of complex molecules, let alone kind of planets and stars, and even life is even more complicated. So that kind of fine tuning, I think, is in itself enough for some people to actually say, well, there must have been a creator to kind of invoke this, to be able to kind of have the forethought, if you like, to go, it needs to be done this way in order to allow what
so
God
it's got
intended.
That design feel rather than accidental result.
So, maybe to put a little bit of numbers, I don't want to go too detailed, but so there's a Canadian scientist called Dr. Hugh Ross, who has tried to come up with a number for basically the chance of life occurring on Earth based on as many different possible things that had to fit, if you like. Yeah. So he's calculated this, and if people want to actually look into his working for this, you can actually check this out. So there's a website called www.reasons.org, where he actually kind of steps through all the different kind of assumptions and things with this. So he says that there's a 1 in 10 to the power 282, so that's like a 1 with 282 noughts after it, that life would, it kind of, if you like, spontaneously come about, and the kind of associated parameters you have to make it work are so incredibly precisely tuned and scarce, if you like, to make that work. Now, some scientists would kind of perhaps push back a little bit on this and saying, well, yeah, because we're saying that's kind of inevitable, because if we you have to have that fine tuning in order to make us, and therefore we've then reflected that back on that, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So, but perhaps, but also I think maybe a kind of maybe bigger question, and one we can kind of maybe think about broadly is, I think there's still a question in that, why is it necessary for such a universe to exist? Because it's all very well saying that it can exist, but there's another question to say, why should it exist? And I think that's where faith maybe can start to kind of weigh in on these kind of big questions.
And faith tends to answer different questions than science attempts to, doesn't it? And that's some of the classic things that we might bring up in these discussions around, over a pint or with someone over your Christmas dinner. Might be not to dive into all the details, because many people, they're not going to be at the forefront, but actually faith is about who and why, and less about where and when, and figuring out specific kind of understandings of. So really good point to make there. So just kind of moving on, because I know we're going to cover a bit of other ground as well. I've heard quite a bit of reference lately to this whole idea of a multiverse, and you've brought in the universe concept and cosmology. Where does that fit into this relationship with science and faith? Can you share just a little bit about the multiverses? Because I can't find that in the Bible, but maybe they're out there.
Well, that's a very interesting point. So actually the term multiverse, actually, even in the scientific community, is used in a couple of different ways. So there's the first way I believe that was the way multiverse was used was by Sir Roger Penrose, and his idea of the universe, this multiverse, was that you had universes, but they were kind of cyclical. So effectively you have the creation of one universe through a big bang or something else, and then that would eventually recede and collapse into a singularity again, and then that would subsequently have another big bang and create another universe. And so you're getting this continual cyclical set of universes, one after the other. So that's one idea, and I don't really think the Bible probably has a lot to say about that concept. Now, there's argument potentially by theologians about the kind of what occurred before the universe, and what God's presence and being was like before that, and actually some cosmologists are actually starting to understand there's this kind of this, in the very first fractions of a second before the Big Bang, there's this idea that actually there were these ripples put in place that subsequently determined the creation of galaxies billions of years later. So that almost like there was like a kind of something that kind of put a little dot there to go, eventually this is going to cause this amazing thing to happen. Now, there's some theologians that actually, cosmologists, that would argue actually it may have been that those ripples may have even been perhaps even before the Big Bang. So then there's kind of ideas about, well, does that point to, again, something before? Anyway, so that's one bit. That's one multiverse.
Yeah, my mind's getting a bit, stretched
sorry.
here.
We won't dwell too much on that. The other idea of multiverse is probably the one that's been more popularized by Marvel films.
Marvel
like
fans, get ready.
And that's idea of this infinite number of simultaneous universes. So for our universe, there is also an infinite number of other universes where there are subtle differences, effectively. So we have an infinite number of universes that all contain the same kind of, probably supposed by the same governing laws, although maybe that's another thing to talk about. But the point is that they're subtly different. And so this is where scientists perhaps kind of push back on the idea of this kind of fine-tuning being like this kind of perfect universe for us, in the sense that, well, that's inevitable, because if you have an infinite number of universes, then of course there's going to be one that's going to be finely tuned for humans. Now, it's worth pointing out, at the moment, we don't have very good evidence that these multiverses exist. And actually, it's going to be very difficult to experimentally prove, because effectively you've got to kind of not literally reach into another universe to get evidence of that, but it's going to be difficult, basically, to kind of prove those ideas.
Maybe it will remain in that whole area of the imagination and the cinema or whatever. Anyway, good to hear some thoughts on that. Maybe we can think a bit about the concept within science that maybe would challenge different ideas about Christianity and other faiths, in specifically the theory of evolution. So we thought about creation. And what does the theory of evolution actually mean, and where does it come from? Can you be a Christian and believe in it? Is it just not an option? How does that work and fit?
Yeah, so I mean, I think probably most people would have heard of Charles Darwin and this idea of of natural selection. So this was this kind of the beginnings of what became evolution, was when Darwin made observations of particular species, looking at fossil records, and observed that there were physical or other characteristic traits that were carried forward through generations, and those were kind of favorable to the kind of evolution, as you call it now, of that particular species. So there were certain characteristics that would make it better for their survival. So maybe a classic example of this is, the early birds were we think now flightless, right? And there were certain traits that made them develop the ability to fly, because that was preferable, because it means they could escape from predators. Now, of course, we know still flightless birds. So for some of the birds in kind of around Indonesia, for example, these birds of paradise, they're still flightless. And that's because they don't have natural predators that would kind of take advantage of that. That's a bit of a really simplistic kind of overview of kind of natural selection. So
this sort of adaptation, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also an important thing is that it's kind of a response to environmental factors. This idea of natural selection. So it's evolution now we would kind of think as the way in which actually all of biology is connected together. It's that idea that it's almost like kind of branches of a tree. Everything you can go eventually kind of lead back to some kind of origin. Hence the origin of species, which is what Darwin proposed in this famous work. So I think, and in subsequent generations, we've kind of built upon this idea, and actually what we call the theory of evolution is still being tweaked, if you like, and people argue about, well, should other aspects be incorporated into that? So in terms of how we can kind of reconcile that, we need to be careful, I think, with the idea of a theory. So we've typically, in the kind of common language, theory can be a bit misunderstood. And I think the theory of evolution, people think, well, if it's just a theory, then we don't really know if it's true
dismiss
or not.
it a bit.
Now, I think most biologists, I think probably all biologists, would say that the theory of evolution is a pretty robust theory. And actually you could equate it to something like gravity. We know gravity. We can observe the effects of gravity.
Most people wouldn't challenge that.
Exactly. And I think really, at least within the scientific community, that would be the feeling about evolution. Now, again, the extent or the reach of evolution is still perhaps under debate, but the kind of fundamentals, I think,
there's a good
case.
Very and so there is a distinction then of adaptation within species or the kinds that you would read of in creation, and possibly everything coming from one fixed point and developing in ways that might be stretch the imagination a bit more. So I guess that's where some Christians might reconcile it.
That's right. Yeah. So there's this kind of idea of kind of microevolution versus macroevolution, and I think there's been a lot of kind of writing about being careful of this idea of the kind of God of the gaps idea, where God kind of fills in the gaps where we don't really know from the fossil record, for example. Is it appropriate to say, oh, well, God just did that, right? Did he just oriented it to be that way? And there was this kind of, because we know that apparently there may be kind of evolutionary jumps that we can't really necessarily explain perfectly with our current science. But I think we need to be a little bit careful of that. So, I mean, I think there are kind of 4 ideas, if you like, that have been proposed generally about how we might understand how faith interacts with evolution. So, I mean, the kind of obvious one is basically to say that what's called kind of recent creationism, which basically says evolution is wrong. This idea that basically the scientific arguments aren't robust enough, and there's other interpretations that could potentially explain what we observe and try to match it more with the Bible's description. So that's one idea.
And would people in that camp tend to be more literal readers of the Bible, or is that a bit of a generalization?
Generally true. I think that's probably a fair thing to say. Now, there are scientists that would perhaps call themselves recent creationists. Not many, probably, but there is one idea that probably is there. So the second one is this idea of what's sometimes termed dialogue. So this is the idea that God was responsible for the kind of the beginnings of life, and he kind of guided the evolutionary process quite in kind of these small steps. So a very kind of hands-on, if you like, approach to it. So he was responsible for the selection of particular species, of why some species prevailed and some didn't. And then he was kind of, again, responsible for that fine tuning, that creative process to the point where the first humans were made in the image of God, if you like. So that's one. And then the third one is this idea of intervention. So this says that God was responsible for kind of the significant steps, if you like, in the evolutionary process, and he intervened at particular points in human history. And in particular, this kind of weaved into this idea is one that was put forward by John Stott, which was this idea that there was a kind of spiritual awakening of of humans, basically, at some point in time during the kind of evolutionary process that allowed humans to be spiritually aware and alive. And so I think a lot of scientists find that a little bit quite compelling, because it doesn't absolutely try to kind of match scientifically how we can understand evolution, but it also illustrates the importance of the impact of God in that, in the kind of,
and he intervenes and he gives creation of human life in the image of God in the way that wasn't before.
Absolutely.
Even though there might have been a caveman. Yeah. That kind of thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the fourth idea is this idea of independence. And that's perhaps a bit more simple. And that says that God initiated the creation process through a big bang or something else. And then he put the physical laws in place and he just let it go. So that's a kind of quite a lot more hands-off.
Yeah.
And I was reflecting interestingly on a previous podcast in this series that James Webb, this is the Barton one, not the James Webb Telescope one, who I was talking with Nicole about this idea of divine providence, and the idea that actually how much God intervenes in our day-to-day life and our decision-making and our path, if you like, through life. And I think we can actually perhaps almost match this up with some of these ideas of evolution. How hands-on was God in that specific process? And so understanding some of those ideas might actually help us to interpret some of these ideas about how hands-on, if you like, God was with the evolutionary process.
Yeah. And so we're acknowledging God as creator, as sovereign, as powerful and able, but not necessarily in a varying degree through these four views having to have everything intervening constantly or standing back and never doing it. So there's sensitivity needed and understanding needed for that. Yeah. Okay, great. So we will save maybe for another podcast dinosaurs and cavemen and all the rest. But what I'd love to explore a little bit is the relevance question of God and the belief in God in the universe at work today. So how might you respond to someone if they said that God isn't relevant because science is eventually going to learn everything about how the universe works? Therefore, a bit like I mentioned earlier, do we need God? Science is basically has done what God really couldn't do.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important question. So it's interesting to kind of reflect that, if we go back 1,000 years or so, actually it was religion or faith that was actually used to understand the world around us, kind of before what we call modern science, I guess, kind of kicked in. Now, of course, through the process of time, we've made different scientific discoveries. And actually, of course, some of those original ideas have had to be adapted and in some cases even replaced. So I guess it's only really natural that we should ask the question, do we need God anymore? Eventually, are we going to have this, what they call this grand unified theory that physics and various other fields are working on to explain everything about how the universe works? And if we can get there, why do we need God? So I think, I guess an important other flip side question is therefore to say, well, is science limited then? Do we have some questions that science isn't going to address, therefore? And so I think that's also particularly prevalent in kind of perhaps modern UK culture, in that sense that science has provided us with wonderful things. Technology advancements in the last few years is incredible. Yeah. It helps us to live quite comfortable lives. And I think it's because of that we kind of maybe get drawn into this idea that, eventually we can do amazing things. Technology and science are just going to be able to just get us to a place where we can, live in some kind of higher being or something.
Free from disease.
Yeah, exactly. So And of course, it's worth pointing out that science is going to keep discovering amazing things about how the universe works. So I think a nice reflection was made by C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity. So he says, supposing science ever became so complete that it did know every single thing in the whole universe, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? And has it any meaning, would remain just as they were? And so I think this kind of gets to the heart of what science isn't really able to deal with in the same way, and actually where faith can actually start to play an important role. Now, science again is very useful, but it doesn't really help us. For example, if someone was to lose a loved one, science isn't really going to comfort that person.
No, they might explain what's happened physically.
Exactly, yeah.
But
yeah,
not be able to show compassion.
Exactly. And it doesn't really help us kind of deal with the kind of root of the problem. Or if someone, for example, is getting treatment for an addiction, again, understanding the kind of roots of that addiction can be helpful, but it's not really ultimately going to deal with that. And actually, of course, a lot of recovery programs are often rooted in Christian principles, the kind of 12-step programs, for example.
Yeah.
And that actually is often the thing that helps people work through the process of overcoming that addiction. Yeah. So, and I think also things like, the understanding emotions like joy and love, comfort, despair, hope, we can't address those fully by just having the scientific description of how our brains work when we experience those emotions.
Yeah.
It can be helpful, but it's not really going to kind of give it the full picture, if you like. So I think we've got to be a bit careful, because sometimes we can get a bit overwhelmed with these kind of questions. So I think it's important that we say we don't need to have a bulletproof answer if someone challenges us with this kind of question. Why do we need God anymore? But I think kind of reflecting back on some of those ideas that we just spoken about, and also kind of other topics like morality and for example, like the Holocaust, we inherently know that was an evil event. I think most people would agree that was. But where does that come from? And so again, science can start to approach a little bit about why maybe socially we have come to that conclusion, but it doesn't really reveal any kind of inherent understanding of what is right and wrong. Yeah. So I think that's why faith is important in that aspect, and having some kind of this idea of truth. I know that's a big topic nowadays, particularly. Yeah.
But essentially, while science seeks to find truth and observe fact and evidence and explain and understand, it can't fill every question that we have as humans. Meaning, love, value, eternity, as C.S. Lewis and some of the things you've said.
Exactly.
So let's take science seriously. Let's learn from science and use our minds that God has given us to engage with understanding the natural world, but also not dismiss the supernatural and the meaning and the things beyond our understanding. Absolutely. So maybe just as we'll pull things together, before we round off, are there any kind of helpful similarities that we can take from the discipline of science and of theology? Because we've said that there's a complementary nature to them. Actually, they're answering different questions. They are both valuable and important. Are there any things you'd like to draw out before we look at some resources?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I've actually got a kind of a book here, which I think I probably expresses this a lot better than I can. So this is the book called The Language of God by Francis Collins. So he's a very well-known geneticist, Christian, and he's kind of the leader, if you like, the Human Genome Project. So he has this idea about this. So I maybe reflect on what he says. So he says, for me, there is not a shred of disappointment or disillusionment in the discoveries about the nature of life. Quite the contrary, how marvelous and intricate life turns out to be, how deeply satisfying is the digital elegance of DNA, how aesthetically appealing and artistically sublime are the components of living things, from the ribosome that translate RNA into protein, to the metamorphosis of the caterpillar into the butterfly, to the fabulous plumage of the peacock attracting his mate. Evolution as a mechanism can be and must be true, but that says nothing about the nature of its author. For those who believe in God, there are reasons now to be more in awe, not less. And I think that really portrays nicely this idea of having this awe about the creation that we marvel at and are acutely aware of, draws in those aspects of this importance of faith and how actually they can be complementary, they can inspire. And I truly do believe, and I know Francis Collins also believes this, that actually having faith and being tuned in, if you like, to God can really inspire scientific discovery. And perhaps even maybe we'll go back to Lemaitre, for example, earlier on, those first ideas about the Big Bang Theory. Maybe that was inspired.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know. But so I think that's a really important point to kind of understand how those things can complement each other, fuel each other in a way. And so, I mean, I don't have any objections to those things being in unison.
In unison and leading somewhere. And
Absolutely.
the point was kind of leading to awe of God, worship, we would call as Christians, a response to understanding the world more, and just very aware of thinking a bit about Proverbs in our teaching series, and the way that Solomon was gifted with wisdom and understanding of the natural world.
Absolutely.
And it led to worship and wisdom that benefited society and the Jewish people in their faith, as well as for Christians today as they engage in that. So
there's one kind of analogy that I also quite like related to this, is this idea of kind of examining a piece of artwork. So if we were to kind of scientifically examine that, we can look with lots of different instruments and look very precisely and say what kind of brushes and paints were used. And so that's really good about telling us how the art was made, but we don't know why the artist actually decided to paint things in that way, decided to paint the particular picture that he was. And so in order to be able to get that, we have to be able to have some kind of communication with the creator. And so again, understanding that is a whole different set of questions, but it's just as relevant. And so I think that's kind of nice as a kind of interpretation of why we need both
definitely
aspects.
That's good. So that's really helpful. If some of the listeners have kind of had questions that have arisen during your explanations and this discussion, maybe want to do some reading or YouTube searching for further, there's a lot of information out there, but it's not necessarily all good. Can you give us some pointers into good resources?
Absolutely. I mean, the first one I would say actually is this book, The Language of God by Francis Collins, partly because it also describes his own journey from atheism through to Christianity, and he quite openly admits that as a scientist he was shocked by the fact that he'd never actually looked into a lot of the evidence for God. And actually discusses this quite nicely, but also goes through a lot of the fundamental questions associated with science and faith. So I think it is a really good read. Some others, there's a website which I think I talked about earlier called reasons.org, and that has a lot of different resources that are useful for this topic. There's a podcast series called Unbelievable, which is hosted by Justin Braley on Premier Christian Radio. And he's had a lot of different eminent scientists and atheists debating on topics related to science and faith. I think those are really great resources and gives you that balanced view, and you can kind of dig into kind of what the kind of both sides, if you like, of those arguments. So I think that's really good. In particular, there's, in fact, most recently, they've actually, I think, as part of that, developed a course in links with Professor John Lennox, who's a very prevalent Oxford mathematician, Christian, has debated the big names, if you like, on this. So they've developed a course related to that. I think it does cost some money. So, but if people really do want a deep dive, that's good. And then there's another website called reasonablefaith.org that has some quite interesting resources, again, on topics that are kind of related, some of them which are slightly more on the edges, if you like, of some of this discussion, but are really useful. And one particular debate I found really interesting was between William Lane Craig, Jordan Peterson, I'm sure many people will have heard of, and a naturalist called Rebecca Goldstein. And this was basically on the concept of whether there is a meaning to life. And this is, of course, a huge question, but it's very interesting seeing their different perspectives and actually how science kind of fits into that kind of argument. So, but I think it's worth pointing out that with all these resources, even within the scientific community, people who are Christians as well, there's still debate. We don't have, a perfect grand unified theory, if you like, about how all this fits together. So I would really encourage anyone who is watching or listening to actually dig into that for themselves. Really try to understand some of those things so we can help to point people in the right direction when we talk about
that's excellent. And one of the verses that just came to mind is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and mind.
Absolutely,
and so we're loving God, we're worshiping God as we engage in these questions. And you've helped us begin on that journey, maybe some for the first time, others again as a bit of a refresher. But thank you so much for joining us, Jon, and giving us your time and expertise and understanding on this. And I'm sure we'll have further follow-up sessions around this topic, which is huge. So thank you for listening and joining us today again on Postcards from Antioch. And do tune in again, as we'll have another episode coming up shortly. Thank you and goodbye.